Okay, we're going to start the movie about 10:10. For people who don't know me, my name's Chuck Curry. I'm on the board of directors. I've been doing revival movies at this theater since last July. Tonight, we're going to screen the George Romero's 1982 film Creepshow, which was written by Stephen King. Now, we have a special guest at this theater who's a member. His name is David Brody. He worked on the film, and he's going to spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about his experience, what he did on the film, and working with one of the legends in this business, the genre business, the horror genre business, which is George Romero. So without further ado, this is David Brody. Give him a round of applause.
Great.
All right.
Well, I worked on the last segment of Creepshow, and that's the roaches, which everybody remembers the roaches because it's become an icon. For those of you who don't know what Creepshow really is, Creepshow is a comic book come to life. That's what Romero and Stephen King envisioned when they made the film. They are as old as I am, and they grew up reading the old E.C. horror comic books. And that's what Creepshow is. It's an old E.C. horror comic book. For those of you who have never seen them, the comic book had 4 or 5 short stories in it, bridged by a ghoul or a witch or an evil person, introducing each story, and that's what they did in Creepshow. And Creepshow was shot in comic book color, bright, vivid color, and to imitate the comic book. I did not work on the segment alone. I worked with a friend of mine, Raymond Mendez. And Raymond Mendez is a model maker and a wonderful fabricator of things that we used in the film. I worked for the Museum of Natural History, and I got a phone call from somebody who said at the other end of the phone, "Hey, do you have any roaches at the museum?" And I said, "Yes, we had roaches there that we used for educational purposes." And he said, "Can I come and see them?" I have no idea who this person is. He shows up at the museum, and they call me, and I go downstairs, and here's a tall gentleman wearing a suit that probably cost about $3,000. And I'm dressed like this. And he says, "Well, let's go see the roaches." And I take him to the area where we kept them, in a fish tank. And he looks at them, and he makes a face. And he goes, "Okay, I'll get back to you." And he leaves. I have no idea who this person is. A week later, the phone rings, and the same person on the other end of the phone says, "Can you be at our studio in Lower Manhattan?" And he says, "Oh, and bring some roaches." Okay. I take the subway. You all know what a subway is. I take the subway down to Lower Manhattan, and I go into an office that says Laurel Show on the front door. And there are carpenters there banging around, and they're constructing this office. And he says, "Come into the bathroom and bring the roaches." And I say, "Okay." And here's the sink that they had just put in. It's not connected. It's just hanging on the wall. And he says, "Dump the roaches in." And I said, "But they'll get away." He says, "I don't care." As I dump the roaches, he pulls out a Polaroid and takes 2 quick shots. Boom, boom. He then says, "I'll get back to you." The phone rings a week later, and the same voice says, "Can you be in Pittsburgh?" And he gives me a date. And I could. And we'll FedEx a ticket to you. That was done. And I get on the plane, and I land in Pittsburgh, and there's a limousine waiting for me. And also, "Oh, bring some roaches with you." It's always that line, that tagline, "Bring some roaches." I go into the office, and there's a woman at the desk and says, "Oh, you're the roach guy." And I said, "Yes." He said, "Go on upstairs." I go into the office upstairs, and they're sitting around the table is Stephen King, George Romero, and the guy in the suit who was Richard Rubenstein, who was the director. They slide a script across to me, and I scan it very quickly. There was an outline with it. And Stephen King had written a screenplay that called for many different kinds of insects within the framework of the film. And I say to them, "You can't do that. You can't just import insects. It's against the law." They're worried about insect escaping. So then and there we agreed to use different life stages of roaches. We had 3 different kinds of roaches. 2 different kinds of roaches, I'm sorry. We had the American, 3 different kinds, that's right the first time. We had the American roach, which is what you call the water bug, which is called euphemistically the water bug because we don't like to say roaches. We had hissing cockroaches. Those, if you poke, they go psst, psst, and they're very slow moving. The American roach, the first one I mentioned, is fast. It's like lightning. And a very disagreeable insect to work with because they have a long pheromone, a smell, that when they get upset, they release the pheromone and it clings to your clothing. We had 22,000 roaches on set when it was all said and done. They flew us to Trinidad to collect giant cave roaches, which were that big. And we actually went into the cave and counted out. We counted out 2,000 roaches, if you can believe that, in the cave, while the bats were flying around, and it was quite an experience, that part of it. We had permits for the roaches basically because Stephen King had really hit it big, and he was wildly popular. And combined with my connections and Raymond Mendez's connections at the museum, they let us bring in the roaches. We collected them in Trinidad. We set the boxes up in Trinidad. So all we had to do is get them on the plane. The boxes were constructed in such a way that they could look in. The customs people could look in and make sure that we weren't smuggling anything in but roaches. And when we hit the Kennedy Airport, the airport of Kennedy, there was a sensation of course. There were 6 boxes of roaches, and they were all scurrying around in there. From there, we flew on to Pittsburgh. The studio had given us a trailer for our roaches, which we, of course, called the Roach Motel. What else would you call it? The roaches were named. We had the Stephen Roach and the George Roach. We named them after the people on set. How do you handle 22,000 roaches? That's an interesting question. You get garbage cans, 33-gallon garbage cans. Ray Mendez, in tremendous insight, had white ones ordered. So you walked into the room, and there were 4, 5 garbage cans, all on wheels. And that's where the roaches were. We had egg dividers in the garbage cans, and that's what the roaches clung to. A layer of sawdust on the bottom, and then monkey chow is what we fed them, and lettuce, because they needed they needed to have some moisture, and that's how we provided that. You walked into the room, and you didn't know there were any roaches there because it was quiet. You didn't make any noise. When we needed roaches on set, we would pick up these egg dividers and shake them into something, and we'd get our roaches that way. You take a roach, or any insect, and you put it in a plastic bag, and you squirt in a little CO2 gas, and the roach goes to sleep. It goes limp. And that's a key way of working with these insects. That's the way you manage them. For the big scenes on the floor, excuse me, we built corrals. Corrals out of foam core. Foam core can be cut with a razor blade, so you can make an instant wall with a little bit of tape. Spread around the top of the foam core is a liquid called Fluon. Fluon is a super slick liquid, and it dries almost instantly. And the roaches cannot climb over it. That's very important. Downtime is terrible on a film. You want to do everything as quickly as possible because time is so much money. E.G. Marshall was cool about the roaches. If you watch the film carefully, you'll see that only 1 or 2 scenes were there any roaches on him, and that's when we placed them on the road. The Saint scene, which was one of my favorites, was done with a platform. The roaches were put on a platform, put to sleep, and slowly we raised the platform up from underneath the sink. That's how that was done. Roaches were placed in light fixtures manually. There was no CG in this film. All this was done, you know, with our hands. At some point, Stephen King wanted E.G. Marshall to wear rubber gloves to make him even look crazier than he was in the film. He was supposed to be in the film. But I told him that rubber gloves on and off would take forever. You got to powder your hands. So we opted for the cotton gloves. Cotton gloves, none of you are old enough to realize this, but in the olden days, I love that phrase, women would put cream on their hands and go to sleep. And they wear these white cotton gloves so the bedclothes would not get greasy. So we put We put them in white cotton gloves and made it even look nuttier, which is what we wanted to do. Stephen King at one point came to me and said, David, what creeps you out most about insects? And I said back to him, not knowing where they are, and which is really true. That's how the final scene in the movie came about. You know the film, you've seen it. E.G. Marshall retreats into his hermetically sealed bedroom. He has a heart attack. He falls backward. He flips the covers off. Now, when he flips the covers off, that was all our roaches. All our roaches that we had, 22,000 roaches were on that bed, all asleep. He has a heart attack. He falls backwards on the bed. Now we substitute a mannequin, and a bad mannequin, by the way. If you look at the face of the mannequin, it was deliberately made to look like a comic book figure. He falls backwards on the bed. I'm underneath the platform that he fell back on, and we have a giant syringe that Raymond Mendez made. The syringe was about that big around, with a mouth that was about that big around, and we filled it with roaches, and we slowly pumped them up. When it hit the chest wall from underneath, we had shaved the latex very, very thin, and we had fake blood with Karo syrup. The Karo syrup, the corn syrup, was put there so the roaches wouldn't all disappear. They would feed on the syrup. So that final scene in the movie, which really hits hard, it's really a dynamite shot, worked the first time. There was no retake on that. We couldn't do a retake on that. Well, I crawled out from underneath the platform and went around the front, and everybody on the crew was looking at all those roaches in one place. They just really couldn't believe it. Stephen King grabbed me around the waist and danced me around the room. He liked that scene so much. Stephen King is a really good guy, by the way. He lives in Maine. I don't know why he lives in Maine. I don't know why anybody lives in Maine, because it's cold. He gives a huge amount to charity, to odd charities. He's an all-around good guy. And Romero was that way as well. They're ordinary people like me. And he was not, King impressed me, he really did. There are always parties after every night. And we all smoked, I'll leave it there. But the whole crew, it was a very, very young crew. Also non-union. That's why he shoots there. He doesn't want to have to deal with the movie. That movie cost $10 million. And he said to me, I can't believe how much we're spending on this movie. That was his biggest movie in terms of money that Romero had ever made. Anybody have any questions? Oh, come on.
What are the charities?
Oh, they're Romanian charities, for God's sakes, bizarre charities. There's a Romanian colony in Maine, and they're impoverished. And he gives them money. And I found that out because there was a bio of him written in New Yorker magazine, and it was just a two-line squib in that bio of King. That guy's imagination just blows me away. I cannot quite believe it. I mean, the Green Mile, come on. I mean, just, what's the other one they show all the time? The Green Mile and
Shawshank Redemption.
And the Shawshank Redemption. Thank you. And I mean, two films opposite end of the Shawshank Redemption. The Green Mile is probably one of the saddest movies I think I've ever seen. I mean, if you really look at it from a long view, it's a terribly, terribly sad movie. No other questions?
How long do the roaches stay asleep when you gas them?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
How long do the roaches stay asleep when you gas them?
Not very long. You had a very small window, and you had to move fast because they wake up very, very quickly. Romero commented, is that how quickly they disappeared. And that was a problem for them because they had to have them on camera. But they move so fast. The American roaches are very unpleasant to work with. They really, really are, because they're so fast. I worked with them with Penn and Teller, with David Letterman. And there we dumped roaches on David Letterman's desk as a joke. And that went off pretty well. That went off very well. Penn and Teller are amazing guys, too. I did a lot. We cut a snake in half on though I don't remember what show that was. But we cut a snake in half, but not really. It just looked that way. A lot of magic is misdirection. You know, they get you to look at something else while they're doing something. Any more questions? Come on.
How do you collect them all when you're done?
With our hands.
Yeah.
With our hands. They go back into the containers with our hands. We had CO2 canisters all over the place. We had them on wheels because we had to gas so many. That's what we call it. We gas some roaches was the line, common line that was thrown about. And sometimes they come back out of the gas. If they're old and weak, they don't. Like people, they're very much like people that way. But yeah, go ahead.
Two questions. You said everything on that film was practical, right?
Yeah.
What's your opinion of CGI and the effect it's had on movies in the last?
Well, I look at CGI in a number of ways.
Yeah.
When they substitute an animal for a CGI, they're not stressing the animal. The animal gets away with it. They're not killing any animals. I'm not going in the jungles of Trinidad and collecting roaches out of a cave. It's all artificial and it's easier on the animal. So that's the way I look at it. I have a very positive, I mean, you know, we flew roaches. I worked on Joe's apartment with Ray. He was the principal on that. And we flew roaches. I mean, you know, we didn't know if we could do it. And it turns out that if you take a piece of fishing line and you glue it with a piece of instant glue to the top of his body and you pick him up, he'll fly. And you can fly him around. You can move him around on a fishing rod. So we did that in Joe's apartment. But Joe's apartment was a different ball of wax because we were using a very, very small roach. We're using the little household roach. And they're a little harder to deal with in one sense. You have to have very good hands for that. The other question?
Yeah, Tom Savini, was he on the set?
Oh yeah, Tom Savini's out of his mind.
Yeah.
I
met him a couple times.
Yeah, he's a good guy. I say he's out of his mind because of what he does and the way he behaves. But he's okay. I have a poster signed by him someplace. And he's in every movie that Romero ever makes. He's the garbage guy in Creepshow. You'll see him there. So, no other questions?
How long did it take you to get all the roaches on the bed?
How long did it take to get the roaches on the bed?
Yeah.
That was pretty quick because they were all gassed.
All right.
And we just laid them out. And then we put the cover over it. You know. But it's also interesting that Stephen King and Romero were not happy with the roaches. They were not comfortable with them. Which coming from King and given what he writes, surprised me. It really surprised me that he was uncomfortable with them. The other side of the coin is that Ray and I were so flip about it. The crew really didn't like us too much. And they didn't like the roaches either. At one point, halfway through the filming that we're doing this stuff, these white suits came out. They put us in these white paper suits to protect us from the roaches. We looked like Michelin men. It was very, very funny. I don't know why they did that, but I think the crew was a little upset with the roaches, and they were worrying about them, contact with them. But the roaches were clean. I mean, the cave roaches, we knew where they came from, and we were in the caves with them, so that was not the problem. The American roaches were bought. The studio bought them from the deep colony, and they used roaches for laboratory use, and that's where they came from. And the hissing roaches that came from the pet trade. Hissing roaches are very slow. So when you mix them all together, you have some semblance of order. If you just use the American roaches, you would have nothing. They would just be gone. You know, so you needed a slow-moving insect. The cave roaches were about that big, and they were very slow. You could pick one up and put it on top of your hand, and it would sit there, and then suddenly decide it's a little too bright, and slowly crawl around to the underside of your hand and hang there. They're very, very interesting insects. They're almost like animals. They're so big. I mean, and I really like the big ones. We named the big one Stephen. Back to it. Any other questions?
Do Stephen King and George Romero still do work together?
Yeah, they're friends. They are friends. I didn't know that until I went in on the film. But I don't know what they're doing now. I really don't. I don't know what Stephen King is up to now. Sort of lost track. I'm retired, by the way. I'm an old retired guy. I live up in the Poconos. So, with a border collie, a tarantula, and a tarantula. Everybody should have a tarantula. That's a philosophy of mine. I used to keep a large home zoo, but I stopped doing that. I don't like keeping animals in fish tanks. I don't think it's a good deal. Good deal for the animal. My whole attitude about exotics has changed. Any other questions? Okay, enjoy the film. I can't stay for it. I'd like to, but I have to be someplace. I've got a dog up in the Poconos that misses me. So, but my favorite isn't the Roach one, by the way. I like The Lonesome Death of Jody Verrill, which is bad Stephen King acting. But there's a pathos to it, a sadness to it, where he says it's the Verrill luck. He gets the meteor goo on his hands and he's dying. And it's just so sad. It's a very sad film. But that's always been my favorite. My son likes the one with the crab, right? That's the one?
The one on the beach, yeah.
Yeah, on the beach one, which I consider the weakest one. Because, thanks, Ralph. They got somebody who told them they could train a crab. I don't know who told them that. But you can't. You can't train a crab to do anything. Anyway, you can train a roach to do anything. You make it look like they're doing things, which is... By the way, here's another term I'll throw out at you. The term wrangler. A Hollywood term for people who work with horses and cattle. We instituted it for roaches. We became Roach Wranglers. And that was the first time that had ever been put in the lexicon. Anybody had ever used it on that level. So now I am a Roach Wrangler, if you want to get right down to it. I always, every time I use the word wrangler, I think of a rope, roping animals. Okay, I'm going to let you enjoy the film, and I'm going to move on. And I hope you've enjoyed the little talk. I will see you when I see you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Appreciate that.
Okay, take care now.
You got it.
Give me a minute.
That's your
Yeah.
baby.
Here's another question I'll throw at you. What's your favorite horror movie? I know what yours is. What movie scares you the most?
Halloween.
Halloween does. You back?